On March 4th, 1973, an oppressive, unnatural stillness enveloped the woodland bordering Chapin within Saginaw County, Michigan. Wayne and Bill Summers, two young brothers traversing an overgrown logging track, stumbled upon a scene that would irrevocably shatter the peaceful veneer of their formative years. The partially clad remains of a young woman. Her striking cranberry-hued coat, a garment well known to those acquainted with her, bore visible stains, and the inherent purity of the Michigan countryside was forever tarnished. When the Saginaw County deputies arrived, the scene presented a horrifying tableau. The initial flicker of hope that Dawn might have simply absconded or been held against her will was extinguished by the grim reality. She was discovered bearing the marks of numerous gunshots, specifically .322 caliber projectiles, 2 to the head and 1 to the back. Evidence of a violent altercation was unmistakably apparent. Abrasions on her arms and ripped clothing, silent testaments to a desperate struggle for survival. The young wife and mother, who had been full of life and aspirations mere weeks prior, had met a violent end. The initial hypothesis of a random disappearance crumbled. A predatory individual had been present. Someone meticulous, someone who had orchestrated a brutal, nearly flawless crime scene, offering few immediate avenues for investigation. For close to 3 decades, the unsolved murder of Dawn Lee Swan Maguar cast a long shadow over Michigan. A life cut brutally short. A husband, a mother, and a son left adrift, yearning for answers that remained elusive. Before we delve further into this shocking narrative, we invite you to subscribe and like this video. Your engagement is instrumental in bringing these often forgotten stories to light and ensures that you won't miss future uploads from us. Dawn's demise was not merely a localized tragedy. It represented the initial crack that exposed decades of clandestine violence perpetrated by her killer. In 2001, advancements in DNA technology led to the identification of a suspect. This was not an unknown vagrant or a random stranger. It was a man with a documented history of violence, whose presence in the area was confirmed, and who had previously been a person of interest in similar brutal crimes. He was an individual who had moved amongst the populace of Michigan for years, his monstrous secret carefully concealed. This case underscores the unwavering resolve of families who refused to abandon their quest for truth, the dedication of detectives who tirelessly pursued cold cases, and the power of modern investigative techniques to give voice to victims silenced by time and violence. The community of Chesaning was irrevocably altered. A pervasive fear swept through the tranquil village, akin to a frigid wind sweeping off Lake Huron years after the event. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, hushed whispers filling the air. The hidden darkness lurking beneath the surface of small-town life was revealed, and it would burst forth spectacularly when the truth emerged nearly 3 decades later. The most chilling aspect was the primary suspect, with his disturbing past, had eluded justice for an inordinate amount of time. For decades, he had lived what appeared to be an ordinary existence, raising his own family, his unimaginable secrets meticulously hidden behind a facade of normalcy. Where are you joining us from today? Share your location in the comments below. We are consistently fascinated to observe the reach of these narratives and how they connect us across vast distances. Today, we will meticulously retrace the events of January and March of 1973. We will follow the threads of decades of unanswered questions and unveil the critical breakthrough that ultimately delivered a measure of justice, however delayed, to Dawn Lee Swan Maguar. This is a chronicle of profound loss, tenacious persistence, calculated deception, and ultimately, justice that, though long deferred, could not be denied. Chesaning, Michigan, in the crisp air of January 1973, epitomized a quintessential Midwestern village, where the predictable cadence of agricultural life harmonized with the quiet murmur of close-knit families. Its residents cherished their placid routines, the solemnity of Sunday church services, and a profound sense of communal solidarity, where unlocked doors were a testament to trust and mutual support. In a charming two-story residence on Elm Street, imbued with the warmth of a new marriage and the delightful, albeit sometimes demanding, sounds of a young family, resided Dawn Lee Swan Maguar with her husband, Donald, affectionately known by all as Dawn, and their infant son, Peter. At the age of 20, Dawn possessed a vibrant spirit and a zest for life, recently married, and embarking on the exciting endeavor of building her future. Friends fondly recalled her infectious laughter and a discerning eye for selecting unique gifts, a trait that frequently led her to charming boutiques and the bustling aisles of nearby shopping centers. As a new mother, Dawn skillfully navigated the demands of her responsibilities while simultaneously embracing the opportunity to explore new dimensions of her life with Dawn. On the morning of January 27, 1973, a distinct chill permeated the Michigan air, yet Dawn's spirits remained buoyant. No one could have possibly foreseen that it would prove to be a fateful day. Dawn departed her home, as was her custom, after bidding Peter goodbye and entrusting him to Dawn's care. She was borrowing a silver 1970 Ford Pinto from her neighbor, Mildred Albright, a relatively new model that felt like a modest indulgence. Her destination was Aso, a larger town approximately 20 minutes away, where she planned to visit the Aso Plaza, a modern shopping center housing a variety of establishments. She had compiled a list of necessities for her new household with Dawn, and perhaps a few small tokens she had identified for her mother, Eleanor Swan, whose birthday was fast approaching. The journey was a familiar one, the sky above a muted winter gray, portending the quiet beauty of a Michigan Sunday. In that era, security in shopping centers was virtually non-existent in the modern sense, yet the plaza thrummed with activity. Dawn moved through the various stores, selecting household items and pausing to admire window displays. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, she encountered Janice Simpson, a close companion from her high school days, near the entrance of J.C. Penney. They exchanged cordial greetings, briefly discussed Dawn's life with Peter and their plans for the week, and made a pact to connect more substantively soon. Dawn, her arms laden with packages, smiled and mentioned that she had a few more errands to complete before returning to Chesaning to prepare dinner for Dawn and to relieve him of childcare duties. It was a brief, unremarkable encounter, yet it marked the final confirmed sighting of Dawn Lee Swan Maguar. As the late afternoon sun began its premature descent, casting elongated shadows across the snow-dusted fields, Dawn's anxiety began to mount. Dawn should have been home hours ago. Peter, typically a cheerful infant, had become fretful, his contented coos replaced by insistent cries that Dawn struggled to quiet. He stood on the porch, periodically venturing to the end of their street, peering expectantly towards the main road where Mildred's Pinto should have appeared. The cheerful ambience of their home gradually yielded to an unsettling silence, punctuated only by Peter's escalating wails. Dinner, which Dawn was scheduled to prepare, remained untouched. Inquiries made to Mildred confirmed that Dawn had not yet returned the borrowed vehicle. As darkness descended, thick and heavy, the once lively residence felt hollow, filled only with Dawn's escalating dread and Peter's relentless cries for his mother. There was no message, no warning. Dawn, the bedrock of Dawn's new life and Peter's entire world, had vanished into thin air. The initial unease rapidly transformed into suffocating panic. For Dawn and Dawn's mother, Eleanor, each passing hour intensified a chilling question. Where had Dawn Lee Swan Maguar gone? And what fate had befallen her after that cheerful exchange at the Aso Plaza? As the clock ticked past 9 o'clock in the evening, Dawn could endure the uncertainty no longer. His heart pounding with apprehension, he reached for the landline, his hands trembling as he dialed the Chesaning Police Department. His voice, hoarse yet resolute, conveyed to the dispatcher, "My wife is missing." Peter, now utterly exhausted, had finally succumbed to sleep in his crib, but his silent presence weighed heavily. Within 20 minutes, the stark black and white patrol cars of the Chesaning Police and the Shiawassee County Sheriff's Department pulled up to the curb, their flashing lights casting jagged shadows across the front lawn. 2 officers, Patrolman Jedediah Clark and Deputy Roscoe Hammond, entered, their notebooks poised, posing precise, practical questions that felt almost cruel in their detachment. They requested Dawn to recount Dawn's exact schedule, the time of her departure, the specific mall she visited, and anyone she might have encountered. Dawn responded with meticulous detail, his voice strained but firm. Dawn's mother, Eleanor Swan, sat beside him, her face ashen and etched with worry, nodding in affirmation, her gaze occasionally drifting towards Peter's quiet room. Deputy Hammond inquired about Dawn's attire when she left. Dawn closed his eyes, visualizing her. A warm cranberry red wool coat, dark denim jeans, and her beloved worn leather boots. She always dressed with a simple elegance, but with a distinctive flair, he whispered, his hands clenched. The officers pressed further, probing whether Dawn exhibited any signs of depression, if there had been recent marital discord or financial burdens that might prompt her to leave. Dawn nearly lost his composure. No, he insisted, his voice rough and deliberate, silencing the room momentarily. She had no reason whatsoever to abandon this family. No reason to leave me and Peter. The officers scribbled additional notes and exchanged a skeptical glance that did not escape Dawn's notice. He felt scrutinized rather than supported. Beyond the confines of the house, the police presence drew neighbors closer. Initially, a few peered cautiously from behind their curtains. Then, Marjorie Peterson, an elderly woman from next door, arrived with a casserole, her eyes wide with concern. Harold Jenkins, the mailman who resided down the street, approached with a flashlight, offering assistance in the search. Whispers circulated, some offering prayers, others indulging in speculation. The Maguar residence, once a sanctuary of newlywed bliss, devolved from tension into utter disarray. The landline rang incessantly. Calls poured in from Dawn's brothers, Max and Larry Swan, and from friends like Janice Simpson, all posing the same query, is it true she's missing? Have you found anything? Dawn repeated the same weary response. No, we don't know anything yet. Eleanor sat in a corner, clutching a framed photograph of Dawn, trembling, feeling their once secure world transform into something foreign and terrifying, acutely aware of Peter sleeping peacefully in the adjoining room, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. As daylight dawned on January 28, 1973, the pervasive darkness and unease lingered. Residents of Osso and Chesaning emerged from their homes, deeply unsettled by the previous night's news. Stories buzzed in corner diners and at gas stations. Anxious glances were exchanged on the way to school, all revolving around the disappearance of Dawn Lee Swan Maguar. For Dawn and Eleanor, it was their first morning without Dawn, a morning when fear crystallized into chilling reality. Peter awoke, his confused cries joining the heavy silence of the house, a constant, poignant reminder of his mother's absence. Police returned early, accompanied by large maps to delineate search zones. Dawn, haggard from a sleepless night, indicated locations Dawn frequented in Osso. Eleanor, after comforting Peter, meticulously recalled every detail of Dawn's habits at the mall, pinpointing where she typically parked. At 8 o'clock in the morning, an emergency meeting was convened at the Osso Police Department. A search team was assembled, comprising city police, the Shiawassee County Sheriff's Department, and numerous community volunteers, including neighbors, friends, and even strangers compelled to assist. Hastily printed flyers bearing Dawn's photograph and the bold inscription, "Missing. Have you seen Dawn Lee Swan Maguar?" were disseminated along roadways, at convenience stores, churches, and gas stations. A copy was affixed to the entrance of the Osso Plaza, the site of her last confirmed sighting. The search commenced along Dawn's usual routes. Groups fanned out across Asso and the surrounding rural roads, meticulously combing alleys and calling her name with diminishing hope that she was merely lost or injured. K9 units traced her scent from the mall's parking lot to the main thoroughfares, but the trail abruptly vanished as if Dawn had been consumed by the town itself. By midday, a palpable tension gripped the search effort. Dawn, having entrusted Peter to Eleanor's care, stood at the periphery of the search, his gaze flickering with a hope that waned with each negative shake of a police officer's head. Asso residents congregated near cordoned-off areas, exchanging whispered speculations. Local reporters meticulously documented every development, and the Asso Argus Press ran a prominent headline: "Young Chesaning Mother Vanishes. Police Expand Search." In the afternoon, the search extended to less frequented parking lots and quiet streets surrounding the Asso Plaza. It was then that a team of volunteers, led by Officer Charles Finch of the Asso Police Department, approached a secluded lot nestled behind the old Montgomery ward, partially obscured by a cluster of pine trees. They spotted a silver 1970 Ford Pinto. A light dusting of dust coated its windows. As they drew closer, a collective sense of dread settled upon them. It was Dawn Lee Swan Maguar's car. Police immediately secured the area, instructing everyone to maintain a safe distance. Dawn and Eleanor were summoned to the scene. Upon beholding the familiar borrowed vehicle, Dawn's legs nearly gave out. Eleanor sobbed, clinging to Doris Miller, a family friend who had joined the search, her thoughts consumed by Peter back home, unknowingly awaiting a mother who might never return. Within the car, police discovered Dawn's recently purchased packages resting on the passenger seat. Her brown leather purse lay on the dashboard, but the car keys, habitually in the ignition, were scattered across the floorboard near the driver's seat. The seats themselves appeared undisturbed, and the doors showed no signs of forced entry, yet the disarray of the keys hinted at a struggle, a forceful exit. Everything suggested that Dawn had merely stepped out briefly and intended to return, but she never did. No trace indicated her subsequent movements. The car, silent, cold, parked beside the pines, stood as a mute witness to an incomprehensible disappearance. As the afternoon sun faded, the Michigan sky deepened to a somber gray. Officers stood around the vehicle, their expressions grim. Dawn watched, his mind fixated on a single terrible thought. Something dreadful had occurred. For Dawn and Eleanor, the faint hope that Dawn was merely delayed shattered. For Peter, unbeknownst to him, his young life had been irrevocably altered. For the Asso community, the discovery of her abandoned car marked the first shock in a prolonged, haunting mystery. That night, the question, "Where is Dawn?" resonated through every household, spreading through the towns like an insidious, unshakable fear. That evening, after establishing a perimeter around the secluded lot behind Montgomery Ward, the Asso police made the decision to tow Dawn Lee Swan Maguar Silver Pinto to the Shiawassee County Sheriff's Department for thorough processing as a critical crime scene. The vehicle was carefully loaded onto a tow truck amidst the tense silence of the search team and lingering residents. Dawn stood nearby, his red-rimmed eyes tracking every movement, a nameless dread echoing within him. The car had been recovered, but Dawn remained missing. The police convoy navigated the cold January night, transporting the sole significant piece of evidence to the forensic investigation room. The atmosphere within the sheriff's department was thick with intense focus. A dedicated bay was cleared, draped with canvas tarps, and barricaded for meticulous examination. Forensic officers, equipped with the rudimentary tools of 1973 magnifying glasses, tweezers, and flashlights, proceeded with strict adherence to protocol. They commenced by photographing the car from every conceivable angle: front, rear, sides, and roof. Every detail, from the dust on the windows to scuff marks on the tires, was meticulously documented. As the examination progressed, Detective Arthur Bennett, a seasoned officer from the sheriff's department assisting with the case, observed something unusual. On the floor mat in the passenger side footwell, barely visible beneath a package, lay a small dark stain. Under a handheld ultraviolet light, it exhibited a faint luminescence. A technician carefully swabbed the sample, sealing it in a labeled vial. It might prove to be an innocuous stain, or it could be blood, a direct indicator that Dawn had sustained harm prior to her disappearance. Another technician examining the driver's seat discovered a single short strand of coarse dark hair lodged in the seat's crevice. It differed markedly from Dawn's lighter, finer hair. It was collected with sterile tweezers, sealed in a small plastic bag, and meticulously labeled. Every sample was catalogued, photographed, and documented. To the investigative team, even the most minute detail held the potential to unlock the case. However, in 1973, forensic technology was severely constrained. DNA analysis remained decades away. Blood typing could only categorize individuals into broad groups, and hair analysis was largely comparative, lacking the definitive power of modern scientific methods. A small stain in the unfamiliar hair, though carefully preserved, led nowhere without corresponding data for comparison. While the forensic team toiled, the station's hallways buzzed with reporters. Local newspapers relentlessly updated the unfolding narrative. News of the car's discovery spread like wildfire through Asso and Chesaning, instilling a profound sense of unease. That evening's television broadcasts on local channels opened with an image of the tarp-covered Pinto, a Chiron reading, "Missing woman's car found, but she remains missing." At the Maguar residence, Dawn and Eleanor sat in somber silence before the television, observing Mildred's familiar car displayed on the news. Peter, sensing the pervasive anxiety, whimpered in Dawn's arms. Eleanor sobbed, repeating, "If the car is there, where is my girl?" Dawn offered no answers, only holding her and Peter close. He understood that the newfound evidence offered no solace, only a deepening of their profound fear. Finally, a preliminary report was drafted. A vehicle had been discovered in a secluded parking lot. All personal effects belonging to the victim were found inside. There were no indications of theft. A suspicious stain had been collected from the floor mat, along with an unidentified strand of hair. For the police, this report represented a necessary procedural step. But for the Maguar family, it felt like an incomplete verdict. Something terrible had undeniably happened to Dawn. The following morning, January 29th, the Asso Argus Press hit the newsstands with bold headlines. "Missing woman's car found, still no Dawn Maguar." The Shiawassee County Sheriff's Department found itself under immediate pressure from both the media and the community. Yet, while searches continued externally, a more discreet, meticulous investigation unfolded behind the station's doors, concentrating on witness interviews conducted at the Asso Plaza, the site of Dawn's last known presence. Detective Barnes and Detective Brenda Frell dedicated the morning to poring over initial statements and painstakingly sketching out timelines by hand. They confirmed Dawn's departure from the plaza around 2:40 p.m., a detail corroborated by Janice Simpson's recollection and further supported by Mr. Silas Croft, a stoic clerk at the plaza's Woolworths, who remembered seeing a young woman in a cranberry coat exiting the premises with packages around that time. However, what prompted the detectives to repeatedly review their notes and diagrams was a consistent, albeit vague, detail emerging from the parking lot's periphery. Phyllis Harding, who was employed at the plaza's record store, had reported observing Dawn in the parking lot. Phyllis stated that after leaving the store, she had paused to load groceries into her trunk a few rows away from where Dawn's car was parked. She briefly witnessed Dawn conversing with an unfamiliar man, described as tall with receding brown hair, wearing a worn denim jacket. They appeared to exchange a few quiet words for less than a minute. Crucially, Phyllis also distinctly recalled seeing a dark blue Ford pickup truck, an older model, idling nearby, which then slowly pulled away as Dawn and the man disappeared from her view, walking briskly towards the rear of the lot. The police listened intently, noting the details. A male, approximately in his 40s, with receding brown hair, clad in a worn denim jacket and a dark blue Ford pickup. However, Phyllis had not seen his face clearly, and the distance rendered her uncertain whether they were acquainted or engaged in a casual conversation. Ronald Davies, a janitor at the plaza, later confirmed observing an old, faded dark blue pickup truck parked unusually far from the main entrance for a considerable portion of the afternoon. No one, however, could recall the license plate number. These were merely vague, but noteworthy observations. In the briefing room, as the compiled witness accounts were presented, Detective Barnes frowned. They had established a sequence of events. Dawn left the Asso Plaza at 2:40 p.m. A mysterious dark blue pickup was observed, and multiple witnesses saw her speaking with an unknown man, but nothing was concrete enough to identify a suspect. The witness descriptions were consistent, but lacked definitive identification. Everything stalled at the stage of suspicion. The Maguar family was summoned for an update. Upon hearing the detailed accounts, Doan could not suppress his tears. He recognized Dawn's familiar gestures, the way she carried bags, her slight smile now being described by others. She wasn't worried. No signs of anything wrong, Doan stated, his voice choked. That only signifies that someone did something to her immediately after she departed the store. Eleanor held his hand, her thoughts drifting to Peter, who had remained clinging to her all morning, sensing the palpable sorrow. Within the ASO community, such unsettling details disseminated with alarming speed. Whispers circulated about the dark blue pickup truck and the peculiar man spotted in the plaza lot. Some individuals adamantly claimed to have observed a similar vehicle parked in the vicinity on prior occasions. Others asserted having noticed a man matching the description near the store, though these were merely unsubstantiated rumors. Law enforcement meticulously recorded and scrutinized each anonymous tip, cross-referencing names and vehicle descriptions, only to ultimately discard them due to a lack of verifiable corroboration. That same evening, local radio news outlets broadcasted the most recent eyewitness accounts, detailing the dark blue pickup and the unidentified individual. The announcer read, "Witnesses recount Dawn Maguar's final moments. Who was the enigmatic man?" The townsfolk listened, many shaking their heads with a shiver of apprehension. From an ordinary young mother engaged in her daily shopping, Dawn had inexplicably transformed into the central figure of an unresolved enigma, and the ASO police, despite possessing a few scattered puzzle pieces, were still incapable of assembling a coherent narrative. The official investigation report concluded on that particular day. Dawn Maguar was last observed departing the ASO Plaza at precisely 2:40 in the afternoon. Several witnesses reported a dark blue pickup truck in the general area, and one individual saw Dawn in conversation with an unknown male. There was insufficient data to identify a definitive suspect. The following morning's newspaper featured the headline, "Witness testimonies offer fragments of insight, yet Maguar's disappearance continues to elude resolution." In the Maguar residence, Dawn and Eleanor gazed at the paper, feeling ensnared within a labyrinthine darkness. Peter, usually a cheerful chatterbox, seemed subdued, reflecting the somber atmosphere. All avenues explored, all paths investigated, ultimately led to frustrating dead ends. Weeks bled into a somber eternity for the Maguar family. February had yielded to March, and still there remained no sign of Dawn. Dawn and Eleanor found solace in each other's embrace, their initial panic morphing into a dull, persistent ache. Peter, now 14 months old, frequently gazed toward the front door, his innocent babbling tinged with an inquisitive tone, as if anticipating the return of a familiar presence. Eleanor, diligently caring for him, attempted to offer reassurance, saying, "Mama is coming home, my darling." However, the words felt hollow even to her. The extensive search efforts had gradually diminished, and the hastily distributed flyers had become weathered and torn. The ASO Argus Press no longer featured prominent daily headlines concerning the case, opting instead for more restrained, subdued updates. The flicker of hope that had ignited in January had dwindled to a faint, fragile ember. Then, on the afternoon of Sunday, the 4th of March, 1973, a new wave of horror began to unfold. 10-year-old Wayne Summers and his 12-year-old brother Bill Summers were exploring a dense thicket of woods on the outskirts of Chapin, a small, unincorporated hamlet within Saginaw County, not far from Chesaning. This area was a familiar haunt for local children, a place where they often constructed makeshift forts and chased after small woodland creatures, a wild, secluded expanse characterized by its winding deer trails and dense undergrowth. As they ventured deeper, nearing an old, disused logging path, a noxious odor assailed their senses. Following the source of the stench, they stumbled upon a scene that would forever be etched into their memories. A body, partially obscured by thorny bushes and a thin layer of winter debris. Frozen in sheer terror, the boys scrambled back to their home, bursting into their living room where their parents, Quentin and Helen Summers, were engrossed in reading the Sunday newspaper. "We found something," Wayne stammered, his complexion ashen. "There's a person in the woods." Within the span of an hour, deputies from the Saginaw County Sheriff's Department arrived on the scene, under the command of Sheriff Vernon Hayes and his principal investigator, Detective Alvin Greer. The wooded area was immediately secured and cordoned off. Forensic technicians, working with urgency against the rapidly fading daylight, confirmed their grim suspicions. The partially clad remains belonged to a young woman. Her cranberry red wool coat, dark denim jeans, and well-worn leather boots were still recognizable. The wedding band adorning her finger unequivocally established her identity: Dawn Lee Swan Maguar. The news, delivered by Detective Greer to a stunned and collapsing Eleanor, struck the Maguar household like a physical blow. Their most profound, unspoken dread had materialized into a horrifying, undeniable reality. Dawn was not merely missing. She was deceased. The coroner's preliminary examination at the discovery site, and subsequently the full autopsy, painted a grim and brutal picture. Dawn had been subjected to sexual assault. She had been fatally shot 3 times, with 1 shot to the back and 2 to the head, all inflicted by a .22 caliber firearm. The precision with which the fatal shots had been delivered indicated a deliberate act of extreme violence. Furthermore, there were evident signs of a struggle, including abrasions on her arms and torn clothing, suggesting Dawn had desperately fought for her life in her final moments. The location where the body was found offered few immediate clues beyond the remains themselves. The frozen, hard ground had preserved some evidence, but simultaneously made the recovery of clear footprints or other forensic traces exceptionally challenging. The investigation immediately escalated in intensity, transforming into a homicide inquiry spearheaded by the Michigan State Police, with Detective Barnes and the newly assigned Detective Sergeant Steve Harshberger taking the lead. The .22 caliber firearm became the immediate focal point of their efforts. Law enforcement began a systematic canvass of gun owners within the Chesaning and ASO areas. One individual, Robert Shaw, a resident of Chesaning who had known Dawn through casual acquaintances, was quickly identified. Shaw voluntarily surrendered his .22 caliber weapon for ballistic testing. However, forensic analysis, rudimentary by contemporary standards, but thorough for the 1973 era, swiftly exonerated his firearm. The unique rifling marks imprinted on the bullets recovered from Dawn's body did not correspond with those produced by Shaw's weapon. Another promising avenue of investigation dissolved. News of Dawn's discovery spread like wildfire across the state of Michigan. The ASO, Argus Press, published a stark, black-bordered headline: Dawn Maguar's body found. Murder investigation launched. The initial shock gave way to profound grief and a chilling apprehension that permeated the once tranquil communities of Chesaning and ASO. Who could perpetrate such an atrocity against a young mother? Public pressure mounted relentlessly on law enforcement to apprehend the perpetrator. Within the Maguar household, the sorrow was overwhelming. Dawn moved through a fog of shock. Eleanor endured episodes of uncontrollable sobbing, holding Peter close, as if attempting to shield him from the incomprehensible evil that had irrevocably touched their family. Dawn's brothers, Max and Larry Swan, arrived, their countenances grave, offering what solace they could. The funeral, a somber occasion held at St. Christopher Parish in Chesaning, was attended by hundreds of mourners. Father Michael O'Connell spoke eloquently of Dawn's vibrant spirit and the profound magnitude of their loss. Eleanor held Peter, a tiny, bewildered figure, in her arms, as Dawn's casket was slowly lowered into the earth. The assembled community offered condolences and shared hushed prayers. Yet an unsettling disquiet lingered, a dark shadow cast by the unsolved murder. As weeks transitioned into months, and the harsh Michigan winter gradually gave way to a tentative spring, the investigative leads began to grow cold. Detectives Barnes and Harshberger pursued every single tip, interviewed hundreds of individuals, followed up on every reported sighting of a dark blue pickup truck, and meticulously cataloged every piece of evidence, including the coarse dark hair recovered from the vehicle, the blood stain, and the collected bullets. However, the disparate fragments of information obstinately refused to coalesce into a discernible pattern. The perpetrator appeared to have vanished without leaving any discernible trace, much like Dawn herself. Detective Sergeant Harshberger and Detective Sergeant Mark Pendergraft, who joined the investigation to assist in organizing the ever-increasing volume of documentation, found themselves increasingly frustrated. In the absence of new evidence or a concrete suspect, the investigation stalled slowly and painfully. By the close of 1973, the initial fervor had considerably diminished. The large box, meticulously labeled Maguar, Dawn Lee Swan, Murder, January 1973, was relegated to a high shelf in the Sheriff's Department evidence room. Inside, it contained hundreds of pages of reports, detailed search maps, crime scene photographs, and sealed samples such as the bloodstain, the unidentified hair, and the preserved bullets. All were stored, awaiting the advent of new technological advancements or an unforeseen breakthrough that might rekindle the case. No one could ascertain when such a day might arrive. For the Maguar family, however, this silence did not signify a conclusion. Rather, it marked the commencement of an agonizing decades-long vigil for justice. Dawn, Eleanor, and young Peter would continue to bear the unbearable weight of Dawn's memory, a wound that time would never fully heal. One quiet evening, as twilight settled over Chesaning, Eleanor sat gently rocking Peter, softly humming a lullaby. He shifted in her arms and then pointed a chubby finger toward her face. "Mama," he babbled, his clear, sweet utterance piercing through his grandmother's heart. Eleanor froze, her eyes welling with tears. Dawn, observing from the doorway, experienced a profound and aching sorrow. Peter, in his innocent simplicity, had inadvertently given voice to the devastating truth of their loss, unknowingly calling out for the mother he would never truly recall. The case of Dawn Lee Swan Maguar had officially transitioned into what investigators termed a cold case. For Chesaning, the formerly tranquil village now bore the indelible scar of a brutal, unresolved murder. By 1978, 5 years after Dawn Lee Swan Maguar's disappearance, the atmosphere within her family home had undergone a profound transformation. Dawn Maguar, once a vibrant young husband, had become a man etched with quiet grief. He labored diligently, returned home to Peter and Eleanor, and prepared meals, but his eyes invariably held a perpetual sadness. Eleanor Swan, despite her unwavering resilience, visibly aged under the oppressive weight of her daughter's unresolved murder. She assumed the role of Peter's primary caregiver, a constant, loving presence, although every mention of Mama by Peter, now a bright-eyed 5-year-old, still evoked a bittersweet pang. The Maguar family persevered in their prayer vigils, a tradition they had maintained steadfastly since Dawn first went missing. Annually, on January 27th and again on March 4th, they would gather with a small contingent of loyal neighbors, including Mildred Albright and Marjorie Peterson, at St. Christopher Parish or outside their home. Choked voices would lift hymns into the cold Michigan night, prayers sent heavenward with the fervent hope that the truth would eventually emerge. For Dawn, Eleanor, and young Peter, this was their only means of preserving Dawn's memory, ensuring that the world did not forget her presence and her love. Peter, growing taller with each passing year, stood beside his grandmother, clutching a small white candle, his young face earnest, a silent participant in a grief he was too young to fully comprehend, but instinctively felt. The press, after a few years, would occasionally revisit the case, but the tone shifted perceptibly from initial empathy to outright pessimism. It was labeled a forgotten murder, another unsolved homicide in Michigan's long list. Such stories inflicted deep wounds on the Maguar family, who never forgot, living with her absence every single moment. For society at large, however, time eroded memory, and Dawn Maguar gradually became another name on Michigan's extensive ledger of unsolved murders. Within the Chesaning community, Dawn's case cast a long shadow. Some individuals openly acknowledged their diminished hope. At first, we clung to optimism, one resident admitted, but after so many years, if the killer were ever to be found, he would have been apprehended already. Others whispered theories that she must have encountered a transient individual or someone from outside the area. The divisions that had initially surfaced solidified into a palpable fracture within the community, fostering a pervasive unease and eroding the trust and connection that had once been taken for granted. Peter grew up under the persistent shadow of loss, carrying memories of a mother he knew only through stories and faded photographs. He was a quiet, contemplative child, often found sketching in solitude, his imagination serving as a sanctuary from the heavy silence that occasionally enveloped their home. In school, he sometimes faced cruel taunts. "Your mom was murdered, wasn't she?" Those carelessly uttered words would leave him weeping at his desk. Dawn, his father, remained his steadfast anchor, yet the profound loss unintentionally created a distance between them at times. Peter occasionally felt as though he were confronting the world entirely alone, even within the quietude of his own home. He would frequently trace the outline of Dawn's face in old photographs, wondering about the woman whose life had been so brutally extinguished. For nearly 2 decades, Dawn Maguar's case file remained untouched in the cold case unit storage, gathering dust. The initial clues, the small bloodstain, the unidentified hair, the preserved bullets, remained sealed. The technology available at that time was simply not sufficiently advanced to conduct definitive analyses. The Michigan State Police juggled dozens of new cases, diverting essential budget and manpower. Dawn Maguar became merely a name on a file among hundreds in Michigan's extensive compilation of unsolved missing persons cases. Yet for the Maguar family, particularly for Peter as he entered his early 20s, the silence never represented a true conclusion. Each vigil, each brief newspaper mention, each report detailing new scientific advancements sparked a flicker of hope. This fragile optimism sustained Peter, fueling his anticipation for the day when the silence would finally be broken and the truth behind his mother's disappearance would be irrevocably revealed. In the mid-1990s, a subtle yet significant advancement began to emerge within the field of forensic science: the advent of sophisticated DNA technology. What had once been relegated to the realm of science fiction The ability to identify an individual from a minuscule biological sample was rapidly becoming a tangible reality. At the Michigan State Police DNA Laboratory in East Lansing, a dedicated team, including forensic expert Randy O'Colberry, commenced a re-examination of old, seemingly intractable cases, invigorated by the promise of this groundbreaking new science. Among hundreds of dusty files, one name resonated with veteran investigators like Detective Sergeant Steve Harshberger, who vividly recalled the brutal chill of January 1973 and the young mother who had vanished. Detective Lieutenant Gail V. Tobin authorized a re-evaluation of Dawn Lee Swan Maguar's case, convinced that the preserved biological evidence, most crucially the minute traces of seminal fluid found on Dawn's clothing, could now be retested using revolutionary new methodologies. Harshberger personally retrieved the meticulously labeled box from the evidence room. Upon opening it, he discovered the yellowed pages and sealed samples. It was a decade-old promise awaiting fulfillment, and he knew this was the key, a beacon of light after decades of darkness. Between 1995 and 1998, the Michigan State Police DNA Laboratory embarked on the painstakingly meticulous process. Samples were carefully unsealed. The minute traces of seminal fluid, fibers from Dawn's clothing, and the enigmatic hair were subjected to the demanding new DNA, amplification, and profiling techniques. The results were slow to materialize, but profoundly impactful. Several potential suspects, including Robert Shaw, whose .22 caliber gun had been definitively excluded decades prior, were unequivocally ruled out through DNA analysis. This rigorous process significantly narrowed the investigative scope, confirming that the perpetrator's DNA was distinct and remained unidentified. The task ahead was clear. They possessed a DNA profile, but no match within any existing database. By the late 1990s, Steve Harshberger, who had spent decades periodically revisiting Dawn's file and never truly letting the case rest, felt the pressing weight of time. He and Detective Mark Pendergraph initiated a meticulous review of every previous lead, every individual of interest, and every person with a history of violent crime who had any conceivable connection to the AASO or Chesaning areas in 1973. This was the arduous manual work that predated modern genealogical research methods. It relied on comparing a new, unknown DNA profile to the physical profile of an old known suspect. It was during this exhaustive process that the name Gerald Leroy Wingart resurfaced. His file presented a chilling read for Harshberger, a 1961 conviction for armed robbery and rape during his tenure at the University of Michigan, followed by 6 years of incarceration before his parole in the late 1960s. More strikingly, older reports placed him in the AASO Chesaning area in January of 1973, reportedly visiting a friend. Furthermore, in 1981, he had been arrested in connection with the Laura Mae McVeigh murder case in Eden Rapids, though that charge was ultimately dismissed on a technicality due to procedural violations during the search. The pattern was unmistakable: a violent past, a confirmed presence near the original crime scene, and a history of suspicion in similar brutal crimes. He fits the profile, the dates, the locations, the history, Detective Harshberger murmured to Detective Gail V. Tobin, his voice grave. He is our primary person of interest for a direct DNA comparison. By early 2001, investigators were meticulously preparing their move. Gerald Wingart, then 60 years old, was residing a seemingly unremarkable life in Center Line, a suburb of Detroit, with his fourth wife, Teresa Wingart. He was employed in the accounting department at Chrysler's Sterling Heights stamping plant and was reportedly well respected within his local community. His adult daughter from a previous marriage lived nearby. To his neighbors, Richard and Sandra Ellis, he was simply the quiet man who largely kept to himself, occasionally offering a polite nod or a wave. This veneer of normalcy made the task ahead all the more unsettling. A covert surveillance operation was swiftly put into motion. A small team of plainclothes officers from the Michigan State Police began monitoring Wingart's residence. They observed his daily routines, leaving for work, grocery shopping, his occasional visits to a local park. Their objective was clear: to obtain a DNA sample without his knowledge for a direct comparison with the profile derived from the 1973 crime scene. On the morning of March 5, 2001, their patience was rewarded. Wingart exited his house, walked to his mailbox, and stood there for a few minutes, smoking a cigarette before flicking the butt into the bushes lining his lawn. Once he had returned inside, Detective Clara Monroe, one of the surveillance officers, moved in quickly, retrieving the discarded cigarette butt with sterile tweezers. It was carefully sealed and promptly transported to the Michigan State Police DNA laboratory. The wait for the results was agonizing. Dawn Maguar, now a grandfather, continued his quiet life in Chesaning, still attending the annual vigils with Eleanor and Peter. Now a grown man of 29, haunted by the specter of his mother's unknown killer. Eleanor, her hair now entirely white, still prayed daily for justice. When the call finally arrived just 2 days later, on March 7, 2001, it shattered nearly 3 decades of silence. Randy O'Colberry's voice was calm yet resolute. "We have a 100% definitive match. The DNA from the cigarette butt belongs to the perpetrator of the Dawn Maguar murder." The news sent a jolt through the Michigan State Police. Detective Harshberger experienced a surge of adrenaline mingled with a chilling sense of vindication. A cold case dormant for so long was finally reawakened. An arrest warrant was swiftly issued for Gerald Leroy Wingart. The legal team, led by prosecutor Dwayne Dennis, recognized the constraints imposed by the statute of limitations in place at the time of the crime. Charges for rape and kidnapping could not be prosecuted. However, there was no statute of limitations for first-degree murder. They had their charge. At dawn on March 7, 2001, the quiet suburban street in Centerline where Wingart resided was enveloped in a pre-spring mist. Unmarked police vehicles were positioned at both ends of the street. Officers from the Michigan State Police and the local Centerline Police Department moved into position. As the clock ticked past 6 o'clock in the morning, Detective Gail V. Tobin gave the command. The door to Wingart's home shuddered under the force of a steel battering ram. "Michigan State Police. Search warrant. Open the door." The shout ripped through the morning stillness, jolting the neighborhood awake. Seconds later, the door burst inward. Officers, led by Sergeant Paul Griffin, rushed inside. In the cluttered living room, filled with outdated furniture, Gerald Leroy Wingart stumbled out, his eyes blurry, stammering. "What? What's going on?" In an instant, he was pinned to the floor, his hands cuffed behind his back. The cold clink of metal brought an end to nearly 3 decades of evasion. Neighbors peered from their windows. Richard Ellis, Wingart's next-door neighbor, clutched his chest in shock. My God, he seemed like such a quiet fellow. Always kept his lawn neat. Another neighbor, Doris Maybell, shook her head, her voice trembling. "I waved to him just yesterday." You never know who you're living next to. Wingart, clad in a crumpled gray T-shirt, his hair disheveled, his wrists gleaming in handcuffs, was escorted out. He shouted, "I didn't do anything. You've got the wrong guy." But his cries were drowned out by the clicking of camera shutters. Dozens of reporters, alerted by the unfolding scene, waited. Screens broadcasting Gerald Wingart's apprehension materialized on Michigan television within moments. The on-screen text declared, "Apprehension in 1973 Dawn Maguar, unsolved homicide." At a concise press conference, prosecutor Dwayne Dennis, alongside Detective Gail V. Tobin, delivered the news that reverberated throughout the entire state. After almost 3 decades, we have apprehended Gerald Leroy Wingart, age 60, a resident of Center Line, accused of the first-degree murder of Dawn Lee Swan Maguar. DNA analysis, meticulously safeguarded and re-examined, unequivocally confirms his involvement. Reporters surged forward, camera flashes illuminating the scene. A journalist from the Detroit Free Press inquired, "What was the perpetrator's motivation?" Detective Lieutenant Tobin responded calmly, "It is premature to draw conclusions, but we believe this was a savage, premeditated act of violence." Within the Maguar household, Dawn and Eleanor sat before the television, Peter standing rigidly behind them, his hand resting on his father's shoulder. They watched Wingart in custody. A torrent of emotions surged through them: indignation, relief, and a profound sense of vindication. Dawn exhaled, his voice thick with feeling. "At last, justice has found our doorstep." Eleanor, her cheeks wet with tears, whispered, "Dawn, they found him." Peter, his eyes glistening, squeezed his father's shoulder. "Mom, she hasn't been forgotten any longer." The media erupted, headlines dominating the news cycles. Arrest made in 1973 Dawn Maguar cold case. Gerald Wingart. Quiet neighbor or killer? 3 decades of silence broken. Justice finally speaks. Television stations featured experts discussing how DNA technology, specifically direct comparison, had unraveled the case, hailing it as a significant victory for Michigan's investigative agencies. Chesaning and Owasso buzzed with activity. Many people gathered to leave flowers and candles at the Maguar residence, where Dawn's photograph was prominently displayed by the window. Conversations in cafes, places of worship, and educational institutions all centered on one name: Gerald Wingart. Some expressed outrage. He lived among us all those years, while that family endured such suffering. Others voiced bewilderment. "I worked with him at Chrysler. I never imagined he was a monster." For the investigators, Wingart's arrest marked not an end, but a beginning. They understood the challenging path ahead. Prosecution, trial, and the revelation of the complete truth would be a lengthy and arduous process. Yet, after decades shrouded in darkness, justice finally had a face to confront. For the Maguar family, it was a day to believe that Dawn, wherever she may be, found solace in the unfolding truth. In a Michigan State Police interrogation chamber, on March 8, 2001, Gerald Leroy Wingart sat slumped in a metal chair, his hands manacled before him. His weary face, his disheveled gray hair, and his bloodshot eyes, a result of a night in custody, met the steely, resolute gaze of Detective Steve Harshbarger. The room's clock ticked, a slow, unyielding rhythm marking a confrontation nearly 3 decades in the making. At the initial question, Wingart retorted sharply, "I don't know her. I've never heard of Dawn Maguar in my life." His tone was defiant. Harshbarger remained silent, instead pushing a thick file across the table. It contained photographs of Dawn's vehicle, the Owasso Plaza parking lot, and the detailed DNA report. "You claim you don't know her," Harshbarger stated deliberately. "So why was your DNA found at the location where she was abducted, Mr. Wingart?" "The DNA we discovered on her clothing?" Wingart emitted a hollow laugh. "You're fabricating this. DNA can be mistaken." However, as Harshbarger meticulously laid out the evidence, the carefully preserved biological fluids and fibers from 1973, untouched until they reached the modern laboratory, the 100% match with his discarded cigarette butt, the exclusion of all other potential suspects, Wingart's smile vanished. He stared at the table, the silence stretching. Harshbarger observed his every movement. Wingart's hands twitched, veins pulsed in his neck, clear indicators of immense internal pressure. Despite his past, Wingart refused to yield, denying any involvement and rambling about his difficult life and the injustice of being targeted. He insisted he was merely an ordinary man under pursuit. Harshbarger, a veteran of countless interrogations, recognized that the struggle was far from over, but he possessed the most potent weapon: irrefutable DNA evidence. For prosecutor Duane Dennis, this was more than sufficient grounds for a robust indictment. That evening, at the Maguar residence, Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter learned about the interrogation. When Detective Harshbarger recounted Wingart's denials, a fresh wave of pain and anger washed over them. "He's lying," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. Peter, now standing as tall as his father, gripped his dad's arm. "He won't get away with it. Not this time." The press headlines blared, "Suspect in Dawn Maguar case denies all charges." But for the family and the increasingly incensed community, the DNA spoke more powerfully than any denial. On April 20th, 2001, at the Montgomery County Courthouse, the formal indictment against Gerald Leroy Wingart was announced. Following weeks of forensic analysis and evidence consolidation, prosecutor Duane Dennis declared charges of first-degree murder. The document meticulously detailed every piece of evidence: the perpetrator's DNA profile from the crime scene, the 100% DNA match with Wingart, the forensic report confirming Dawn had been sexually assaulted and shot 3 times with a .22 caliber firearm, and historical records placing Wingart in the vicinity with a documented history of violent offenses. The pivotal element was the direct DNA match, undeniable proof connecting Wingart to the brutal crime. The press room afterward was packed with journalists. Duane Dennis, standing beside Detective Lieutenant Gail V. Tobin and Randy O. Colburn, who represented the DNA lab, held the indictment high for the cameras. His voice resonated. "Justice may be delayed, but it is never denied. Today we charge Gerald Leroy Wingart for the heinous acts that extinguished Dawn Lee Swan Maguar's life. After nearly 3 decades, the truth is finally brought to light." The statement was widely quoted in newspapers and broadcast on Michigan television channels as a definitive declaration. Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter occupied the front row. As the prosecutor read the charges, Eleanor clutched Dawn's hand, tears streaming down her face. Dawn nodded slightly, his gaze fixed on the podium. Peter stood firm, his jaw set. Dawn whispered, "Dawn, they have finally given a name to what happened to you." For the Maguar family, the indictment transcended mere legal documentation. It was validation that Dawn had been the victim of a monstrous crime, not a woman who had simply vanished, as cruel rumors had once suggested. Outside the courthouse, the Michigan community gathered in large numbers. Many held white candles and raised photographs of Dawn for the television cameras. Clara Jennings, an elderly Chesaning neighbor, choked back tears during an interview. "For decades, we lived with uncertainty and division. Today, justice has provided us with an answer." The Detroit Free Press ran a bold headline: "Gerald Wingart formally charged in Dawn Maguar murder." Television stations analyzed how direct DNA comparison had unlocked the case, hailing it as one of Michigan's most significant investigative breakthroughs. Editorials emphasized that society must never forget missing victims, as even a single new clue can bring about justice. For the investigative team, led by Harshbarger and Tobin, the indictment day represented a significant milestone. They recalled retrieving the dusty case file with faint hope. Now it was a full criminal case heading to trial. A surge of relief and determination coursed through them. "We brought Dawn home, and now we must bring Wingart to justice." The trial was scheduled for November 2001. As the date approached, tension escalated. The press dubbed it Michigan's most significant cold case trial in decades. The community was divided. The majority believed Wingart to be guilty, deserving of the harshest sentence. A few felt that evidence dating back decades was insufficient. In coffee shops, marketplaces, and churches, conversations swirled. Will justice prevail this time? The night before the trial, the Maguars lit candles. Dawn gazed at the flickering flame, illuminating Dawn's photograph, whispering, "Tomorrow, Justice begins to speak. Eleanor held Peter's hand, his eyes brimming with resolve. Dawn fought. Now we fight for her. Outside, Michigan seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the moment truth would face justice's light. On November 5th, 2001, the Shiawassee County Circuit Court was packed. Michigan turned its attention to the trial. Decades of waiting had passed, and reporters crowded the halls. Television cameras focused on the entrance as Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter Maguar entered, their expressions resolute. In the spacious courtroom, the 12 jurors sat attentively, facing the presiding judge. Opposite them sat Gerald Wingart, clad in a drab prison jumpsuit, his gray hair sparser, his eyes averted, his face ashen. Prosecutor Dwayne Dennis opened the proceedings with a powerful presentation, reconstructing the events of January 27th, 1973. Dawn leaving the Hawasso Plaza, the dark blue pickup truck observed by witnesses, the frantic search, the discovery of her body, having been sexually assaulted and shot. Then came the forensic evidence, the preserved crime scene samples, the DNA profile, and the 100% match with Wingart's discarded cigarette butt. He detailed Wingart's history of violent offenses and his presence in the area. She fought, Dennis's voice boomed. And that fight, coupled with modern science, has brought the perpetrator to justice today. The defense countered, emphasizing no direct eyewitness saw Wingart commit the crime. They questioned the chain of custody for evidence preserved since 1973 and the reliability of eyewitness accounts from decades prior, attempting to sow doubt. However, the prosecution meticulously rebutted with specific details. Randy O. Colburn testified to the rigorous preservation and analysis protocols. Detective Harshbarger presented a timeline that seamlessly connected Wingart's known movements with the commission of the crime. DNA doesn't lie, Dennis concluded, his gaze fixed on the jury. During the victim's family statement, Peter Maguar, now 29 years old, stood, his hands trembling slightly as he held a framed photograph of his young mother. His voice cracked, but remained firm. For 28 years, I lived without my mother, without knowing why, without knowing who took her. Today, the truth has been proven. My mother was the victim of a ruthless man, and her memory deserves justice. My father, my grandmother, and I implore you to grant her peace. Eleanor sat beside Dawn, both wiping away tears. The courtroom fell silent. Some jurors dabbed at their eyes. The judge banged his gavel for order, but the Maguar's words had resonated deeply. After 5 days of evidence, testimony, and arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. Time crawled. Outside, Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter sat hand in hand, their faces etched with tension. Reporters provided updates. Jury deliberating for 3 hours, then 4. Finally, after 8 hours, the jury room door opened. All eyes turned. The clerk read the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder, the defendant, Gerald Leroy Wingart, is guilty. The courtroom erupted. Eleanor sobbed, embracing Dawn. Peter bowed his head, tears streaming, whispering, "Mom, it's finally done." The judge stood, his voice clear. This court sentences Gerald Leroy Wingart to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He will spend his remaining days behind bars, reflecting on the crime he committed. Headlines screamed, "Justice delivered." Gerald Wingart sentenced to life without parole. Michigan exhaled. Many gathered outside the Maguar residence, lighting candles in tribute to justice. On television, images of Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter, tearful but with bright eyes, aired across the state. Detective Harshbarger remained in the emptying courtroom, gazing at the evidence board that had convicted Wingart. One thought echoed, justice may come late, but it arrived. In that moment, Dawn Lee Swan Maguar's case was closed. No longer an unsolved homicide, but a belated triumph of truth. Wingart's life sentence without parole concluded the trial, but its impact rippled throughout Michigan and beyond. The community struggled to comprehend that the man they knew as a quiet coworker, a polite neighbor, was a cold-blooded killer who had concealed his crime for nearly 3 decades. Neighbors appeared on television, expressing their astonishment. "We knew him from Chrysler. We never thought he was capable of this." It's chilling. The shockwave shook Michigan, prompting questions about how such evil could hide in plain sight. Overnight, national newspapers reported. The New York Times ran the headline, "Michigan man convicted in 1973 cold case murder." Meanwhile, the Washington Post analyzed how DNA comparison had become a pivotal case-breaking tool, and major networks like CNN, NBC, and ABC aired specials emphasizing that Dawn Maguar's case proved cold cases never truly die, thanks to technological advancements and unwavering persistence. Evening talk shows hosted forensic experts, investigative journalists, and families of missing persons. A prominent host opened the program. "What chills us is not just the crime, but that justice can sleep for nearly 30 years, then awaken with a single cigarette butt." As the media frenzy intensified, the Maguar family quietly prepared for a different kind of closure. On December 15, 2001, a memorial service for Dawn was held at St. Christopher Parish, followed by a graveside service where her remains had been laid to rest in 1973. Hundreds attended, not just relatives, but 1973 search volunteers, loyal neighbors, and old friends. The simple headstone, placed decades earlier, now carried a heavier significance. Dawn stood by the grave, his voice choked with emotion. "For 28 years, we visited this stone, wondering. Now Dawn knows peace." Eleanor, holding Peter's hand, read a letter. "My dearest Dawn, Peter grew up to be a wonderful man. He never forgot you. Now your killer is where he belongs." The words brought the assembled crowd to tears. People left flowers, lit candles, and some strangers whispered apologies for once believing the rumors surrounding the case. The service served not only as a farewell, but as a cleansing of the community's collective memory. Gerald Leroy Wingart died in prison on August 20th, 2022. His final appeal denied, his life ended behind bars, a testament to justice's far-reaching grasp. For the Maguar family, the decades-long journey concluded with tears, but also with faith that Dawn had not been forgotten. They continued to live, carrying her memory, dedicating their efforts to cold case advocacy groups. Peter became a strong advocate for cold case resolution, sharing his mother's story nationwide. Chesaning remained a quiet Michigan village, but beneath its tranquil surface, Dawn Maguar's case left an indelible mark. It served as a reminder that evil can lurk in plain sight, that truth can remain buried for years, but also that justice can ultimately prevail through technology, determination, and individuals who refuse to abandon the pursuit. The narrative of Dawn Lee Swan Maguar's case is not merely a personal tragedy, but a reflection of vital truths in contemporary American life. A young mother from Chesaning, Michigan, vanished after a morning shopping excursion, leaving behind her car with purchased items and scattered keys, and a 1-year-old son crying for her. Nearly 3 decades of silence weighed heavily on her family, burdened by rumors and doubt, when in reality, Dawn had been brutally murdered. The killer had left behind DNA evidence. Only through advanced DNA technology in the late 1990s and the perseverance of investigators was the case reopened, ultimately bringing Gerald Leroy Wingart to justice in 2001. The first lesson for American society is that technology and science can give voice to victims once thought lost. It urges investment in forensic laboratories and DNA databases, as a single sample can alter a family's fate, proving that perseverance in evidence preservation is paramount. The second lesson lies in the endurance of family and community. While public memory might have faded, Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter held annual vigils, demonstrating that families must never surrender, even when isolated by apathy. Finally, the story serves as a warning about the vulnerability of everyday safety. A quiet coworker or neighbor can conceal a monstrous persona. Therefore, the lesson for every American today is to remain vigilant, not to dismiss unusual signs, and to maintain faith in justice. Justice may be postponed, but with science and persistence, it never truly vanishes. Thank you for joining us and listening. Please remember to click the notification bell for our latest stories. Stay safe and take care of your loved ones.